This is Wisteria sinensis, Chinese wisteria. And what I'm going to tell you about wisteria has also applies to Japanese wisteria, largely Wisteria floribunda. Because I'm speaking about this in the context of design, the differences in the two types isn't really critical to what I'm going to address. Apparently, Japanese wisteria, the blossoms appear along with the leaves, so they're not as showy necessarily, whereas as you see here, the flowers come out in profusion in the spring, and the leaves are they're still not budded out fully when the show for the flowers has come out. So you get a very big display from Chinese wisteria that's a little more subdued than in the Japanese wisteria. So as you can see here on this large wall, that's a very typical way to use wisteria historically. Also on tops of arbors or trellises, and this is really hard to beat in terms of a display. These flowers are very unique and very prolific, and and graceful. I think that's one of the beautiful things about them. They look like a chain of grapes hanging down or something like that. But what you can see here too is that these are very large plants, and as a designer it's hard to find a spot where I feel comfortable using this plant and think that somebody will be able to keep up with it or maintain it. So when deciding where to use it, I would say that containment is a big deal. Here you see it on an arbor, and that's the most typical way to use this. You also see to the left that the trunk or trunks of this are quite large, and one of the nice things about these, they're very long-lived plants. I mean, they can live over 100 years, so if you use one, that's one of the beauties, is you don't have to worry about it being short-lived. That, along with very easy to grow. These are not finicky plants, they're super easy to grow, and if anything, they're a little too easy. I had one in my yard. It was not blooming, so I chose to take it out, and I still have that plant in my yard. I've tried for about 4 years to get rid of the root system, and I've gone down and dug out roots, and it still keeps finding its way back in. So know that this is an aggressive plant, and you really want to make sure that however you situate it, you've got a way to contain it. And also know too that it will need maintenance. If you put it on an arbor, we typically want people to go in every year to 3 years and do a heavy pruning on an arbor to thin out dead wood, and also just open it up a little. These can really mound up on themselves, so that can become, the space underneath can get really dark. If you're using it as a patio cover, I'm not a big fan of that. We tried it years ago, and that job, the patio got so dark that nobody wants to use it. So as a designer, I like to use it more like you see on this trellis here, where or a pergola, where people aren't spending a lot of time and there's indirect light coming in from the sides. Whereas if you do an entire arbor that covers a patio, unless you like really deep shade, I don't recommend that look, because it also is a bit messy. The flowers drop, birds like to live in there, and the patio ends up being kind of a very natural, darker space. So be aware of that if you're thinking of using it that way. Here's a white variety. These come in mainly lavenders and whites. The Japanese wisteria, there are some pink hybrids. So in terms of care, pruning, these definitely need some pruning every year to 3 years. Water, very little water once they're established, and also they don't recommend fertilizing this plant. If you make it too happy, apparently it may not bloom very well for you. And I think that's really it. It's a beautiful plant, but it's very specific in terms of where you can use it and be successful. Otherwise, it can turn into a big maintenance headache for you. So check your local area and see what varieties are being used and are available, and find a great spot for this, because it's a real showstopper as flowering goes, and it's a great way to kind of bring in spring. This, by the way, is at the very end of March in Central California. In design, one of the things I'm always asking is how long of a show am I buying into here? These bloom 2 to 4 weeks depending on the type and where you're at and what the season is like. So keep that in mind too when you're deciding whether to use it or not, because the show's amazing, but once it's over, you've got a very large plant on your hand, and that's what you have for the rest of the year. Also, some of these are quite fragrant. I lived in a place that had very fragrant ones part of the when they bloomed as well. So something else to think about is fragrance, and that is Chinese wisteria, Wisteria sinensis.